Steve Perry carried a song around for 25 years without ever pressing play. Not because he'd forgotten it, and not because life had simply moved on in the way people like to pretend it does, but because that one melody held everything he'd spent decades running from, and a single voice on a recording, his own voice, had the power to undo every wall he'd built to stay standing. That's where this story actually begins. Not in a stadium with 60,000 people singing his name back at him. Not in a recording studio chasing some impossible vocal take at 2 in the morning while the rest of the band sat in the hallway waiting. But alone, in a quiet room, with a turntable and a set of trembling hands and a song called Faithfully, and 25 years of silence that had to end somewhere. What happened when he finally let himself hear it changes how you understand not just Steve Perry, but every artist who ever loved something so deeply they had to walk away from it to survive. The voice that reshaped rock music arrived in 1977, carrying nothing but 4 octaves and a childhood spent absorbing every record that came through a small house in Hanford, California. Motown records, gospel singers, a mother who sang and a father who sang, and a sound building inside him since before he had language to describe it. Perry didn't come from a music school or an industry showcase. When he walked into that audition for Journey, he wasn't performing for a band. He was releasing something that had been waiting its entire life for a room large enough to fill. Neil Schon, Journey's lead guitarist, later said the decision took 30 seconds. They'd brought in dozens of singers before Perry walked through that door, and none of them had done what he did to the air in that room. What Perry carried wasn't purely technical ability, though he had that in excess. It was the specific gravity of someone who sings because the alternative is unbearable, and audiences felt that difference immediately, in a way they couldn't always explain. The 1978 album Infinity sold over 1 million copies in its first year, with songs like Wheel in the Sky and Lights rotating through radio stations that hadn't heard anything quite like this combination before. MTV, still establishing itself as a cultural force, featured Journey constantly, and Perry's face became something people recognized everywhere he went. But underneath all that momentum, a quieter transformation had already started. The boy from California who wanted nothing beyond singing was slowly being replaced by something more complicated, a brand, a standard, an expectation that grew heavier with every album cycle. By 1979, touring consumed 10 months of every year. Friends from Hanford stopped calling because Perry was never available, and the ordinary rhythms of life he'd grown up around, Sunday dinners and backyard evenings and unscheduled hours, had vanished entirely into the industry machine. Recording sessions that should have finished in 3 hours stretched past midnight as Perry chased vocal takes only he could hear in his head, asking engineers to roll the tape again while the room sat in silence, waiting for him to find what he was looking for. One producer said Perry wouldn't stop until his voice matched the version living inside his imagination, and the honest problem was that the version didn't fully exist in the physical world. Then 1981 arrived with the album Escape, and suddenly Journey didn't just have fans, they had a generation. Don't Stop Believing became the kind of song that refuses to stay inside its own era, appearing in films and television and sports arenas for decades after the record first dropped. Escape sold over 9 million copies in the United States alone and spent weeks at the top of the Billboard charts, turning the band into something beyond arena rock and into a piece of genuine American mythology. Perry's voice was everywhere, on every station, in every commercial break, which meant Perry himself had almost nowhere left to breathe without hearing himself. Sherry Swafford entered his life in the early 1980s as something he hadn't encountered in years, a person completely uninterested in what Journey had made him. An esthetician living quietly in California, she looked past the rock music image to find the man underneath, the one who valued long conversations and simple evenings over industry events and sold-out arenas. Perry described those years as the first stretch in a long time where he felt like himself around another person without having to perform the version of himself the world expected. But loving someone the entire world wants turns out to be its own specific loneliness. In 1984, Perry released a solo single called Oh Sherry, a love song written directly to her and equal parts devotion and apology for every night on the road, every call cut short, every time the music took priority over the relationship. The music video showed them together and smiling, and behind that, the relationship was already fracturing under the weight of a life she hadn't chosen. By 1986, it ended without drama or headlines, just 2 people arriving honestly at the conclusion that this couldn't keep going. Jonathan Cain had written faithfully in 1983, sitting on a tour bus between cities, capturing the particular ache of being far from someone who matters while the miles keep accumulating. But when Perry sang those lyrics, something happened to them beyond what Kane had put on the page. They became confessional in a way that transcended their origin. I'm forever yours faithfully. Even years after Sherry was gone, Perry found himself still living inside that lyric in ways he couldn't fully explain or escape. What came after the 1987 Raised on Radio tour stunned everyone who had watched Perry build one of the biggest careers in rock music. The final show played in Anchorage, Alaska on February 1st, 1987, and within weeks, Perry had stopped returning calls entirely. No farewell concert, no press release offering an explanation, no clean goodbye to the audiences who had followed him for a decade. Phone calls went unreturned. Letters sat unopened. The man who had filled stadiums around the world became unreachable almost overnight. For more than 20 years after that, Perry moved between towns where nobody recognized him, avoided music in every form, and learned to exist outside the thing that had defined him since he was old enough to understand what a melody meant. When Don't Stop Believing played in a restaurant one evening, he stood up and walked straight outside, waiting in the parking lot until the song finished. A friend found him there leaning against a car with his eyes closed and his breathing measured. Perry later admitted that hearing his own voice triggered something he had no clean word for, a specific pain that carried every loss compressed into a few minutes of sound. That silence held until 2011, when he met Dr. Kelly Nash at a support group. A psychologist and breast cancer survivor, Kelly had no investment in Journey or the legend the music industry had built around Perry's name. She wanted to know the person behind all of that, and slowly, more carefully than anything he'd done in years, Perry let her close enough to find him. Music started returning naturally during their time together, not as performance or obligation, but as reflex, humming while cooking dinner, tapping rhythms unconsciously on a steering wheel, letting sound exist in his life again without demanding anything specific from him in return. Kelly's cancer came back in 2012, and before she died that December, she asked him for something real. "Don't disappear again," she told him, her voice quiet but without any give in it. "Promise me you'll sing." Perry held her hand and gave her the words, even knowing he couldn't be certain he could honor them. 2 years later, sitting alone at home on an ordinary afternoon, Perry pulled a Journey album from his collection for the first time in 25 years. His hands shook, putting the needle on the record. The opening piano notes of Faithfully spread through the room, and everything he had kept behind walls for decades came forward at once. He sat completely still through the entire song while his younger self sang with a certainty he no longer recognized as his own. Highway Run Into the Midnight Sun. That version of him had trusted the music completely, had given himself over to it without calculating the cost, had believed without reservation that this was worth everything it required. By the second verse, the tears had started. By the final chorus, something shifted underneath the grief, not healing quite yet, but the first signal that healing was available somewhere ahead. Perry crossed the room to the piano that had gone untouched for years, lifted the cover, and placed his fingers on the keys. The first note came out uncertain. The second followed anyway. Nothing he played that afternoon was practiced or impressive, but the sound was alive, and after everything that had happened, alive turned out to be exactly enough to begin from. Traces arrived in 2018, 24 years after his previous record, and it sounded nothing like what fans had been imagining during the wait. No arena rock built for maximum impact, no vocal showcase designed to prove what time hadn't taken. Songs like No Erasing and No More Crying carried the weight of a singer who had actually lived through something and came out the other side with his honesty intact. Perry's voice had changed with the years, softer in certain registers, marked by time in the way any instrument is marked by the hands that played it. Critics recognized the craftsmanship. Fans heard something underneath the craft that mattered more to them personally, the sound of someone who had finally stopped running from himself. In interviews, Perry spoke without defense about the years away, calling the silence not failure but survival. "Those years weren't wasted," he told one reporter. "Every single one of them was necessary to become who I am now." At a Journey concert he attended without announcing himself, Perry stood in the back of an arena and watched thousands of people singing the lyrics he had written decades earlier back at the stage with everything they had. That moment moved him completely, he said afterward, not because the songs were his, but because they had long since become everyone's. At 75 years old, Perry performs rarely and without apology for that choice. The comeback he made wasn't about reclaiming what fame had consumed. It was about keeping a promise made at a bedside to someone who had known him well enough to understand what he was actually being asked to give up and give back. Faithfully began as a song about devotion across distance, written on a moving tour bus by a keyboardist capturing the loneliness of life on the road. What it became over the years following is something harder to categorize, a document of one man's survival, a record of someone who got lost inside his own story and found the way back through the very thing he had spent 25 years being too afraid to hear. Music didn't destroy Steve Perry. The expectations wrapped around the music did, and the perfectionism, and the weight of being someone millions of people needed something from every single night. But the music, that same song that had held all his ghosts, also reached him when nothing else could. That's what the songs that hurt most tend to do. They carry everything you still need, and they wait.